Our speaker today, John Gerber, is a new member of our society. John and his late wife Phyllis raised their two older sons in a UU congregation in Urbana, Illinois, where they were active members and Sunday school teachers. When they moved to Western Mass in 1992, they attended the UU Society of Northampton for several years. John teaches at UMass Stockbridge School of Agriculture. He has been active in Amherst as a member of the Amherst Conservation Commission, as a board member for the Northampton Amherst Community Farm, and one of two founders of a local group, Grow Food Amherst. I think there's a theme here. In this capacity, he spoke from our pulpit on the value of local food in 2011. When John's wife, Phyllis, died after a 51-year relationship, he chose to join the UUSA to connect with people in our community. John joined the Sunday Services Committee and is now co-chairing this committee with me, as well as serving as Zoom director for several services this summer. That is a real feat. John will speak about spirituality of caregiving based on his 3 years of caring for his wife, Phyllis. So now we have John.
Thank you, Carolyn. I met her when we went back to school right after Christmas break in 1969. My best friend was dating her best friend. We met for the first time in the high school cafeteria. She was in 10th grade. I was a senior. Phyllis Ann Zipporah Ebner, and later Gerber, known as Phil to her friends, and Gigi to our grandchildren, was the center of my life for the next 51 years. We dated through college, got married, had 3 sons who married 3 wonderful women, and gave us 5 grandchildren. Our plan was to get old together, watching our grandchildren grow up and taking care of each other. Our plans changed dramatically on March 15th, the Ides of March, 2017, with the words from a neurologist in Springfield. I think you have Lou Gehrig's disease, and I'd like you to see an ALS specialist. Phil had been experiencing unusual symptoms, fasciculations and leg cramps, weakness in her left hand, and most disturbing for her, she could not keep up with her regular running partner as they ran up and down Amity Hill in Amherst.
Oh my.
The diagnosis of ALS began a 3-year and 3-month journey for us together, ending with her death on June 15th, 2020. I'd like to make clear that although Phil's disease is the reason this story could be told, this is my story as a caregiver. I will share my experience of relying on a spiritual source of strength through the most difficult years of my life. Phil's version of the story would likely be different, as no matter how close 2 people can be, I believe we all walk our own spiritual path. With the diagnosis of a terminal disease for which there is no treatment, my life changed from best friend and partner, walking side by side, to caregiver, attending to her daily comfort and safety. Phil's motor neurons died progressively, and the muscles they should have triggered no longer functioned, first in her hands, then in her legs, her throat, and her tongue, so she could no longer swallow and talk, and eventually her lungs, so that breathing became difficult. Richard Rohr wrote in his book, The Naked Now, Learning to See Like the Mystics, that there are 2 doors into the spiritual journey. One is great love, and the other, deep suffering. We experienced both over the next 3 years. When Phil was first diagnosed, she was full of anxiety, a sense of loss, a feeling of being cheated out of our plans to get old together, and deep, deep sadness. My job was to be supportive, to listen, to love, to care for her to the best of my ability, and not to try to fix her, which of course was my first instinct. Acceptance of the situation as it was, and not as how I wished it would be, was key to my ability to cope with this devastating illness. Early symptoms were annoying. Dropped silverware, a foot drag that tripped her while she was walking, an inability to open a jar because of their weakened hands, our previous long hikes in the mountains. We'd climbed two 13,000-foot peaks in Colorado. These hikes became shorter and on flatter ground. Bike rides were no longer 30 to 40 miles in the hills of Western Massachusetts, but rather 8 miles on the flat bike path from Amherst to Northampton to get a fruit smoothie. Adjustments and adaptation became part of our daily routine. And if we didn't project too far into the future, it was manageable. We reminded each other of the need to live one day at a time and deal with whatever came up that day. As Phil's symptoms became more pronounced, I assumed more responsibility for the laundry, the dishes, house cleaning, gardening, shopping, cooking, making beds, paying bills, and all the routine things that were previously done by two. I began to assist with personal things like dressing and undressing, showering, stretching out muscles that were no longer being used, putting on earrings, body transfers from the power wheelchair to the bed or the toilet. We had help. I would schedule one of her friends to stop by for an afternoon while I went to campus to teach. We hired an aide to help with daily chores and to keep Phil company while I went grocery shopping. A friend created a meal train to deliver food a few times a week, which fed our bodies. And we had a community of friends and family that fed our spirits. There were the disease-specific tasks of managing medications, doctor's visits, dealing with insurance companies, cleaning the feeding tube that had been surgically implanted in her belly, so I could inject the liquid feed into her stomach when she could no longer swallow, and setting up the respirator and placing a mask over her face to assist with her breathing. For my own work, I began to teach all of my classes online so I could be by her side 24/7. I read everything I could about ALS, from personal stories to medical research journals. I investigated experimental treatments and selected one, an experimental drug that we learned later had kept her alive a little longer than she would have lived without it. She didn't get the placebo, she was lucky. I explored other treatments. There was one drug being researched in Europe that a neurologist told me might be interesting. I joined a buying group of 30 ALS caregivers who we met on Facebook. And we had this experimental drug manufactured in Spain and shipped to the US monthly in small packages, paid for by Bitcoin because it was illegal to transport this drug across international borders. We adjusted her diet based on speculations on the cause of the disease, and we tried nutritional supplements. And she continued to decline. I was thankful that I had the physical ability to lift and move her as needed when she could no longer move herself. Although more than once during our trips to the beach in Costa Rica, Aruba, Rhode Island, and Florida, when I was carrying her out of the water on my back, I fell and we both collapsed on the sand, laughing uncontrollably. We had hard times when we cried, joyous times when we laughed and cried. The average life expectancy for someone with ALS is 3 to 5 years after the appearance of the first symptoms. We got 5 years, and I am grateful for that time. She was my constant focus for much of the last 3 years of her life. Friends told me they were amazed at the attention, the patience, and the strength that I demonstrated as a caregiver. What they could not see was a spiritual program I had been practicing for the previous 20 years that provided a source of strength. I want to be clear when talking about my own spiritual practices. They're not shared as a prescription for how to be a caregiver, but rather a description of what I needed to do to stay sane and sober. My practices can be summarized in a series of sayings and suggestions that may sound trite to some of you, but for me, they became powerful principles for living. Principles and practices like living one day at a time, and sometimes 1 hour, 1 minute. Acceptance of life on life's terms. Rigorous honesty mostly with myself about the situation as it was. Praying to remain aware of a connection with some unseen power greater than myself. As an aside, I know there are certain words that make some UUs uncomfortable. I'm told the word prayer might be one of them. If so, you can translate it for yourself into wishful thinking. My hope is that the UU tent is big enough to accept someone like me who prays. I found regular meditation to be a powerful spiritual tool as it quiets the monkey mind. And being of service to others got me out of myself. And when I don't know what to do in any given situation, which happens often when caregiving for someone who's dying, I just tried to do the next right thing, which my 5-year-old granddaughter, Elena, told me came from a song in the Disney movie Frozen 2. These spiritual principles and practices, which had been part of my life for more than 2 decades, were surely tested as I tried to show up for Phil as a loving, caring, and patient caregiver. Deep love and great suffering opened the spiritual door, but the journey was guided by time-tested spiritual principles with roots in many traditions. Zen teacher Bernie Glassman, the clowning bodhisattva who used to live up in part-time in Shutesbury, taught 3 tenets of Buddhism, which are helpful when caregiving. Not knowing is one, which I translate as acceptance. Bearing witness, or just being present for another's pain without trying to fix it, and compassionate action. But what held it all together was a trust in a power greater than myself that I sometimes referred to as God. I suspect the word God is another one of those triggers that makes some of you squirm. But the truth is, I can't tell my story without referring to some power greater than myself. I use the word God because it's short and it's convenient, but I could substitute other words and phrases like Great Spirit, Atman, Buddha Nature, Prime Mover, Holy Spirit, Allah, Divine Presence, Mother Nature. They're all fine terms for some power greater than myself, which I've learned to connect with, to feel like I'm part of when facing things that I cannot change, like Phil's illness. Again, I have a faith that the UU tent is broad enough to accommodate a person like me who connects with something that I don't understand, but I choose to call God. Now, I don't personify God as an old man with a beard. My God is not an all-knowing, all-powerful, Jehovah-like being that makes some people sick and others rich or good-looking. Nor is it a Santa Claus God that I pray to give me stuff, a cure for ALS. For me, this power greater than myself may be thought of as a consciousness, a cosmic, perhaps a unity consciousness that's been described best, I think, by transpersonal psychologist Ken Wilber. This idea suggests that human consciousness may extend far beyond the limitations of our minds to permeate the universe over all time and all space, kind of like the Force in Star Wars. And since nobody knows, well, I get to choose because it works for me. Praying with this God is not designed to change the world around me, but rather to change me. And this God that I choose for myself allowed me to care for my wife while she declined. And did I ever rely on that power greater than myself when things got tough? Phil presented a strong exterior to the world. She was told she was an inspiration, and she was. But when we were alone at night, she would fall apart and could not stop crying. As I held her while she sobbed, my intention to accept life on life's terms was sorely tested. But I knew that if I railed against the inevitable, I would increase her suffering. So I held her and we cried together, my version of bearing witness. ALS drove me to my knees. And on my knees, I prayed for the grace to accept things that I could not change. Acceptance is not resignation, giving up. Nor is it approval. It's not okay. It was a lousy deal we were dealt. For me, acceptance is a prayer and a practice that allowed me to get through the day and sometimes experience a sense of peace and serenity, even when things were difficult, especially when things were difficult. It was hard, really hard. But for me, being Phil's caregiver was the most fulfilling and purposeful time of my life. My constant prayer was to be allowed to continue to do this for just a little bit longer. But that was not to be. Phyllis Ann Zipporah Ebner Gerber, my wife and friend for my entire adult life, died peacefully on June 15th, 2020. Surrounded by our children, lots of flowers, a rose-scented candle, and Beatles music. A few weeks before she died, she told me, using this laser light that had strapped to her head that pointed at letters on a spelling board from which she spelled out sentences, one letter at a time, that she was afraid of the air starvation that would come with dying from ALS. Her whole life, she'd been afraid of drowning, of not being able to get enough air into her lungs. And this was the disease she was given, one that would starve her of air at the end. I promised her she would not suffer. As her caregiver, I had the tools and knowledge to prevent the anguish of air hunger. And for the last 10 days of her life, when she could no longer talk, she would tap her chest to tell me that she was experiencing a shortness of breath. I gave her a few drops of morphine under her tongue, and she relaxed. She remained aware, but no longer in distress. Phil ran out of time. And when she entered that active dying phase, from which she would not reawaken in this lifetime, our adult children and I held her in our care for 12 hours. We sang to her, we gently massaged her hands and her feet. I told her over and over, you are safe, you are cared for, you are loved. We gave her the morphine that prevented air hunger. My final act as caregiver was to help her die peacefully and to help my sons say goodbye to their mother. And she quietly stopped breathing. My role through her illness was to be prepared for whatever Phil needed next. I was good at it, right until the end. What I was not prepared for was living in a world without her. I have a supportive family, and we stayed together talking about Phil, organizing memorials and ALS fundraisers, planting flowers for her, telling stories of Gigi to our grandchildren. I started coming here to the UU Society of Amherst Sunday services, where I found a nurturing community that's allowed me to participate and be of service. And 1 year into the process of grieving, I am surviving. I have much to live for. I have a really good life and one great sadness. I've learned that grieving a loss of this magnitude, much like caregiving, is a spiritual journey that is made bearable by the same practices that held me together while providing for her care. I've been using these practices that I had learned through a spiritual program of recovery for more than 20 years, a time that in retrospect seems like 2 decades of preparation for the challenge of loving and caring for someone who was dying. The practice that helped me get sober 24 years ago, guided me along the way, helped me navigate my own cancer diagnosis and recovery, supported me through the shock of Phil's illness and death. These same spiritual practices have guided me through the early stages of grieving. Those spiritual practices, acceptance, service to others, prayer and meditation, and a conscious connection with some power greater than myself that I do not understand, but that I can feel working in my life. Those practices are helping me now to learn how to live in this world without the one person that I knew I could never live without. That new story includes teaching a job that I love, my fruit and vegetable gardens, Phil's flower garden that I maintain as she designed, several community groups where I do service, my 3 sons and their families, including 5 grandchildren who are the light of my life, and all of you in the Unitarian Universalist Society of Amherst. But that is a story not ready to be told. But that is a story that has just begun. Thank you for listening.